Okay. All right. Hello to everybody who's jumping on. Shalom. Good morning, everybody. Eddie here with Uri Tzedek. So happy to be in community with everybody who's joining us on this call. Whether you're joining on Facebook, whether you're joining on Zoom, you name it, we are happy to be with you today with an exciting programming here and that we're able to be in partnership with an amazing rabbi who my great mentor, Rabbi Shmuley Yanklowitz, has always talked about. So we're really happy to join everybody here. Just a quick reminder of the events coming up. Don't forget about our upcoming Native Dialogue on the 22nd. Also on the 22nd, we have our anti-racism campaign event with Jordan Daniels. Make sure that you RSVP for those events coming up as well. Don't miss out this Wednesday, important event on hunger and poverty, and what that looks like and what is our Jewish response to that. That is going to be September the 16th at 4 p.m. Make sure you don't miss out. And with all ado, Rabbi Yanklowitz, go ahead and take it away.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, it's great to be thinking about this very important topic, especially at this time of year. In thinking about Teshuvah and our work in the world to bring more light into the world. And it's great to do this with someone who's really at the center of it all, someone who I admire, Rabbi Gabriel Kretzmer Seed, who has served as one of the Jewish chaplains in the New York City Department of Correction since 2018, providing spiritual care, religious services, and education to Jews and incarcerated individuals of all faiths or none, as well as staff. He is a 2017 Musmach of Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Rabbinical School and completed chaplaincy residency at Mount Sinai Beth Israel Hospital in Manhattan, where he specialized in palliative care and inpatient psychiatry. And so he is right at the center of this as a Torah scholar and as someone who is doing the work of prison chaplaincy. You should have received already the source sheet. So hopefully you have that accessible. And Eddie can also, you can just pin Eddie if you don't have it, and he can send it to you in the chat or by email as well. So with that, Rabbi Kretzmer Seed, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much to Rav Shmuley, to Eddie for hosting me and for letting me share some Torah and hopefully get the word out about these issues that are so present in our society that I didn't know about until a few years ago, but I have a lot of passion about the need for addressing the criminal justice system and spiritual needs within the criminal justice system, both where it is now and hopefully moving it to a better place for this country. So the time we have, I'm basically going to divide into three parts. Going to talk about my background, about what I do, about some of the issues within the criminal justice system, or at least what I experience on a day-to-day basis in terms of spiritual needs and addressing them. And I'm going to share a studied part of the source sheet together and some of the sources that I've gathered that have really spoken to me in terms of how Torah, the kind of Torah that I associate with the work that I do on a daily basis, and then open up to questions. We're going to have people put in the chat, or however we're going to have people be able to ask questions. So just start again with a little of my background, how I ended up in prison chaplaincy, and then go into what I do on a daily basis and what kind of issues we deal with. So with a longer background, a longer story, I attended rabbinical school at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah, and while I decided I wanted to become a rabbi and I wanted to teach Torah, I really had a totally different idea and different ideas of where I might end up when I started rabbinical school. Chaplaincy wasn't yet on the horizon. I was exposed to chaplaincy. YCT was in the midst of increasing their chaplaincy requirement, and my year had a unique opportunity. We weren't yet required to do a full 400-hour unit of clinical pastoral education, which takes place in a hospital or other healthcare, elder care, other setting, or prison. We weren't yet required to do that, and instead we had a intensive week with one of our other wonderful Rabbi Dr. Jason Weiner, who's the Director of Spiritual Care at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. So we flew out there for a week, and that was really my first major exposure to chaplaincy. And I think I was really taken by it. My father is a rabbi. I've seen the kind of pastoral work he does, both in the synagogue and in hospitals, nursing homes, etc. And I think I was just really taken by the way of a chaplain is able to be with someone in their most difficult place, to provide Torah, to provide prayer, to provide presence, and to deal with difficult theological issues, and to really be present on the ground with people in their time of need. So I first did that intensive week of chaplaincy. I later did a summer internship at a hospital in northern Manhattan, New York City, and afterwards did what's called a chaplaincy residency. Just like doctors have residencies, chaplains also have residencies, where we usually in a hospital spend a year of both education and on-the-ground clinical work. And as originally mentioned, did that at Mount Sinai Beth Ezra Hospital in downtown Manhattan, and did a lot of different kinds of work, including on-call and emergencies, and spent a lot of my time in palliative care and end-of-life issues and in inpatient psychiatry. So when that year ended, I was gung-ho, looking forward, applying to jobs, expecting to end up in hospital chaplaincy in some way, or maybe in hospice, doing the same kind of work. And for whatever reason, maybe it was Bashert, maybe it was God working behind the scenes, none of those positions worked out. And meanwhile, this position had opened up. And both my supervisor in the hospital and actually another Chovei Torah Musmach, Rabbi Andrew Shear, who had this position before me, spoke to both of them, and they encouraged me to apply. And I ended up in prison chaplaincy. What spoke to me and what continues to speak to me, even if it's much harder in a pandemic, much, much harder, and I'll talk about in a few minutes, is hospital chaplaincy. While it spoke to me, gave me a lot of spiritual sustenance, again, being with people in their difficult moments, whether it's end of life or major illness or psychiatric illness. I wasn't using as much of my rabbinic training. I was certainly using some of it, but I was with patients of all backgrounds, functioning as an interfaith chaplain primarily, and going by my first name, and not really functioning particularly as a rabbi, even if my training certainly was what allowed me to be a chaplain. So what's unique about prison chaplaincy is certainly hospital chaplains who do more rabbinic work, and nursing home chaplains, hospice chaplains, but in terms of prison chaplaincy, it's really a combination of that same kind of spiritual care, of being there for people who are in an institution where they don't want to be. Certainly no one wishes to be in jail, and providing direct religious services. One of the, even if this country's in a very difficult place right now, one of the, thank God, good laws that we have is that based on the Constitution and based on the 2000 law, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which came end of the Clinton, beginning of the George W. Bush administration, provides that if someone's institutionalized, whether in jail, prison, even a psychiatric institution, because they're in the United States, they're entitled to freedom of religion, free practice of religion, the same way as you and I are on the outside. And different correctional institutions might implement this differently, but in New York City, it's defined as everyone's entitled to at least an hour of religious education or worship communally, ideally, which was before the pandemic, per week. So we have chaplains of, based on the number of people of each religion who are generally incarcerated. We currently have the 4 largest religions within our system right now are Catholic, Protestant, Muslim, and Jewish. When I started, we had about 8,000 people on a daily basis any given day in custody. Due to bail reform and also especially with COVID, our numbers are down to a little over 4,000 on a daily basis. And which I think is a very good thing. Unlike in other cases, religious affiliation is by self-identification. So anyone, when they're arrested, gets asked their religion, and people can choose their affiliation. And less than 1% of people have a Jewish background, have a Jewish parent, have a conversion, previous affiliation with the Jewish community, but we have between 4 to 5% of people in our system who identify as Jewish. Some might do it for the kosher food, and I'm aware of that fact. I'm not sure if it's necessarily better. I certainly get a lot of complaints about it, and it's something I deal with on a daily basis, but it's sealed. People are worried about how their food is prepared. It could be just general anxiety, or people are worried about who's touching it, and I can totally understand. And Jewish kosher food is sealed, and they know where it's coming from. And a lot of people are spiritual seekers. Whatever faith background they had growing up wasn't speaking to them, perhaps, or they're just looking for something different, something new. So I serve a very, very diverse group of people. Both people who just are on the Jewish list who I visit, people who used to come to my services. Again, so many diverse backgrounds, racially diverse, again, diverse in if they had any previous Jewish background otherwise. And I certainly attempt to treat everyone the same, no matter what. As an Orthodox rabbi, certainly halakha is an important consideration for me. But when I used to have my regular services and classes before COVID, I purposely wouldn't do anything that required a minyan in order to allow everyone to participate in the same way. And that was, again, very important to me. So I'll talk a little about what I would do before COVID on a daily basis, and some of the issues I come up with, and navigating the bureaucracy within a jail. So before COVID, some of it's still the same, some of it has changed quite a bit. But I right now cover 3 different jail facilities. There's 10 jail facilities in New York City, 8 of them on Rikers Island, and 2 of them and I'll answer Eva's question in just a second. Questions in the chat popped up, so great way to ask questions. I cover 3 out of those 10 facilities. Right now there's 3 Jewish chaplains. One of our previous Jewish chaplains unfortunately passed away, so I'm the only one of us 3 who's full-time. The other 2 are part-time. We have a conservative rabbi and a reform cantor who work along with me. Of the 10 facilities, 9 serve men and 1 serves women. So one of the other chaplains serves the women's facility, and I only serve men at this point. Though we do have, because of the way the system is set up, there is a trans housing unit in the women's facility, but for various technical, security, other reasons, we'll often have trans or gender non-conforming individuals even in the men's facilities. So I certainly serve those individuals as well if they're in my facilities. So over the course of the week, I go between those 3 different facilities. And before COVID, I would give 1 to 2 classes / services a week in each facility. So I would usually start with a few prayers. I would start with Ashrei and the Shema often in general. And I would usually give a class for the rest of the time, trying to make it very interactive. I would often teach the Parsha, the weekly Torah portion. If holidays were coming up, this week with Rosh Hashanah on Friday night, I would teach about the holidays. And on Friday, I was able to push, actually, this wasn't the case before I came, but because I was hired full-time, I was able to get a Friday service in this facility that had the most identifying Jews out of the three that I serve, and was able to do a mini Kabbalat Shabbat, sing Shabbat songs and Shabbat class on Friday mornings in that facility. So that would be a good part of my week, was giving the classes, preparing for the classes. I've learned that in jail things run very slowly. Jewish time amplified very much. Things happen, takes time to gather people. In all of our facilities now, inmates, or incarcerated individuals, I should say, even though the short form is often inmates, but that's not very person-first language. They have to be escorted by a correctional officer. So I sit in the chapel and wait for them to arrive to be escorted. That takes time, and often happened at least 5 times last week. What we call alarms, unfortunately, where there's some kind of incident, whether it's a fight or some kind of violence, unfortunately, and the facility basically shuts down. And even though I'm staff, even though I have a badge that gives me some kind of greater access, they still don't want me walking around as what they call civilian or non-uniform staff while there's an alarm. So everything takes up a lot of time, but in the time I had otherwise, I would tour the facility. I would go to different housing areas and just talk to people like I might do in a hospital, and talk to people of all different backgrounds, offer prayer, offer counseling, which I very, very much enjoy, talk to the staff. The facilities are large, even though, as I said, the population has gone down, so certainly can't visit every housing area in the course of a week, but try to visit as many people as I could reasonably over the course of the week. So again, once again, I saw you've asked your question again. I don't serve women in general because I don't work in the women's facility, but there's certainly female identifying individuals or gender non-conforming individuals who end up in the primarily male facilities, and I serve anyone who's in our facility, who's in the facilities I serve. I've gone into the women's facility on a couple occasions for various things, but most of the time I serve in the male facilities. One other aspect, again, before I get to what is different during COVID, what our challenges in COVID are right now, I'll just talk about the mental health aspect of being in jail and prison in the carceral system in this country. And I certainly experience that on a daily basis. So I've read a number of books on the subject, and again, I see it on a daily basis, but you might be familiar, just answer Warren's question. So one of the, we have 2 other Jewish chaplains, a reform cantor and a conservative rabbi. So that conservative rabbi, she serves the women's facility right now. Just to talk about mental health for a few minutes, it's a very important aspect, again, talking about why we're having this shir in general and what I experienced. So the state hospitals were closed in the state psychiatric facilities were mostly closed in the 60s and 70s and 80s. And what was supposed to happen was money was supposed to be allocated for mental health care in the community, for group homes, for outpatient care, etc. But as you might be aware, that's not the case. Very, very much so. So sadly, so many of the people who were discharged from state psychiatric institutions ended up in jail and in prison for acts that they committed, often when they weren't fully in control of their mental faculties. So very, very sadly, the 3 people might not be aware, but the 3 largest mental health institutions in this country, maybe shockingly, are Los Angeles County Jail, Cook County Jail in Chicago, and the New York City Department of Correction, where I work. Public statistics, that almost 50%, if not more, of people in our custody are flagged as having a mental health condition or a serious mental health condition. So we have mental observation units. We have units where people receive more intensive mental health care, and they're certainly getting some care. I work with some of the amazing psychiatrists and therapists who are on staff, but it's certainly not ideal that they're getting that care here as opposed to in a actual psychiatric hospital on the outside. So it's certainly a big issue that a lot of people end up in jail because their mental health needs aren't being met in the community, and they might commit acts that end up to lead to their arrest and incarceration. So as I mentioned before, I worked in the psychiatric unit at Mount Sinai Beth Israel Hospital, and that very much led to, very much prepared me for a lot of the work I'm doing. Unfortunately, there's been at least one case where a patient of mine in the hospital ended up being a patient of mine in jail. So unfortunately, there's this revolving door sometimes between the mental hospitals and the jails and the prisons. So certainly a issue I deal with. You know, I'm certainly not a licensed mental health provider, but I certainly have chaplaincy training, have rabbinic training, and can try to tend to people's spiritual and emotional needs the best that I can. So I'll just talk for a moment about what things are like during COVID. Actually, before I do that, just talk about kosher food for a minute. I did allude to it, but anyone who identifies as Jewish is entitled to kosher food in our department, and grape juice on Friday night as well. And that's all in theory. In practice, we sometimes have issues with the kosher food being served in the way we wish it was, but and I often deal with some of those complaints, but it is, again, a good thing with freedom of religion in this country, that, and especially in New York City, where they're not taking any litmus tests for who's Jewish, but they're going based on people's self-identification. And at least I don't have to make those decisions for the most part. I do deal with a lot of changes of religion, and people change their minds, and I try to make sure that people are doing it for a spiritual reason and not just because they want the food. If I'm filling out the form, but I certainly am not checking anyone's seat, so to speak. I'm certainly trying to be as expansive as possible with who I allow to have their interest in Judaism. So talk about COVID for a minute. I think I'll take the other questions at the end just so we can get to the source sheet as well. So when COVID hit in March, as you might have heard, New York City was certainly hit one of the worst early on in the country, including the Department of Correction here. So Purim was kind of our last hurrah, our last normal service. Everything basically changed right afterwards. And since that point, there haven't been any congregate religious services or programs of any denomination. So I've kind of changed my method of service. So instead of bringing people down to the chapel, every week I try to visit all of my congregants in their housing areas. People live in either dorms, if you imagine a camp bunk in some ways, or a dorm in a homeless shelter. That's what these dorms look like. They're rows and rows of bed with a day room and some showers and toilets, or they live in cells, depending on their level of custody and other different reasons. So I go to those housing areas. I unfortunately only talk to people for 5 minutes as opposed to having an hour or two with them to really have a class, but I have brief conversations with people and make handouts for them to read. You know, whether it's on the Parsha, on the holidays. This week I actually just created an abbreviated Amoxor with probably the exception of 10 or 15 people in our custody. The people I work with don't read Hebrew or understand Hebrew, so I actually created a abridged Amoxor totally in English. So even though we're not having the high holiday services we normally have, that people can still have some kind of small Rosh Hashanah experience, even with these COVID restrictions we're still under. In previous times, we were very lucky to be able to have 7 holiday observances over the course of the year. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Hanukkah, Purim, Pesach, and Shavuot. And each of those observances, all the Jews from these 10 different jails would be bussed together to one facility, and we would have a service and a meal and a party. And on 4 of those observances, people could even bring family members as guests to the holiday celebration. But unfortunately, we've had Pesach was canceled, Shavuot was canceled, and the fall holidays are not going to take place the way we would have wished previously, unfortunately. But again, I still do my best. I still come in every day. I still try to see people individually for counseling, for brief visits, check in on them, and to give self-study material so they can do some kind of Jewish learning and study over the course of the week. So why don't we turn to the source sheet and study a few of these sources together, and then I'll turn to the questions, the rest of the questions over in the chat, and give people more opportunity to ask those questions as well. So if you want to turn to the source sheet that I know Eddie put the link in the chat and was sent out to people beforehand as well. And when I started this job, I just started a Google Doc basically, and every source I came across, I do some daily Tanakh learning, some daily Talmud learning, and again, any source I came across, I would that seemed related to jail, prison, incarceration, criminal justice that spoke to me, I would put in a Google Doc. And this is just kind of a selection of these sources in order to, I think, see what our tradition has to say about criminal justice and where the criminal justice system is in this country right now. Just as one background piece, incarceration is actually not a punishment in Jewish law, in the Torah, or in rabbinic law, with a very small exception. The Torah does talk about people being in some kind of jail environment when they were waiting for the case to be decided, or in 2 cases where Moshe had to turn to God to ask what the decision would be. But being imprisoned for a certain time period, for a certain number of years, is certainly not what Jewish law would prescribe. There was corporal punishment. There were other severe punishments that the rabbis later curtailed, but jail, a prison, was not one of those punishments. And based on some of the books that I've read, imprisonment in the way we have it is very much a modern invention. Before that, it was usually corporal punishment. But very, very many reasons I could speak to about why the current prison system, doesn't really help people. It doesn't correct people, in my opinion. I speak only for myself. I do not speak on behalf of the Department of Correction. Does not really solve a lot of these issues. All right, so without further ado, look at a couple of these sources together. So the first one to look at was from Babylon Talmud, from the Gemara in Brachot 60a. So it's from the last chapter of Tractate Brachot about blessings. And the discussion is about blessings that someone recites when traveling, when entering and leaving a city. So we have a prayer that we say called Tfilat HaDerech, which is related to this. And we say it on a journey. You might be familiar with it. And the rabbis have an additional prayer that we don't really say today. It's in a few prayer books, but it's not generally said, for entering and leaving a city. And you'll see why we don't say it in general, but maybe we should be saying it more, especially in these times. So sages taught the details of Ben Azai's teaching in a Braita. Upon his entrance to the city, what does he recite? May it be your will, Lord our God, that you bring me into the city in peace. After he entered the city, he recites, I thank you, Lord, that you brought me into the city in peace. So that entering, the practice of entering a city was often a dangerous one. You didn't know whether it would be friendly or unfriendly people. If you're familiar in the book of Bereshit, the story of Sodom, that they were very much the epitome of not welcoming strangers. So there are certainly cases in ancient times or even today with racial justice in this country, and what we've seen in the past century, even today, when people of different racial backgrounds are not welcomed in different areas, and much, much more so. So sadly, this prayer, even if it's kind of fallen by the wayside, is certainly still very relevant. And then when the person seeks to leave the city, they recite, "May it be your will, Lord and God and God, ancestors, you take me out of the city." And then similarly, after they left the city, they give thanks for leaving the city in peace. And we'll go to that highlighted section at the end of this section of the Gemara. So it kind of explains why, in theory, we might not recite this today, but why it might be relevant. So Rav Matna said this was taught only with regard to a city where criminals are not tried and executed, as in a place that he might likely be killed without trial. However, in a city where criminals are tried and executed, these prayers do not apply, as if one is not guilty, he will not be harmed. So, and in theory, but sadly not in practice in so many cases in this country and beyond, the idea is that if the place has a justice system, that justice is carried out, and that this person wouldn't be killed or murdered without trial, this person who's traveling to the city. But some say Rav Matna said the opposite, and this very, very much speaks to what I've seen on a daily basis. So one thing I didn't touch on that I really should have at the beginning is just to clarify the difference between jails and prisons. Jails, which is where I work, are where people are generally waiting for trial or serving very, very short sentences for misdemeanors, generally of under a year. But especially with COVID, with courts have been suspended, basically, trials aren't happening. People are often here indefinitely if they didn't get some kind of medical leave or bail reduction, etc. So some say Rabbanah said the opposite. Even in a city where criminals are tried and executed, one must pray for mercy, as sometimes you may not encounter a person who will plead in his favor. So even 2,000 years ago, almost, our sages knew about cases where innocent people are tried and executed, where innocent people are punished. And again, in jail, you have people who are sitting here who no one has, except for the people serving these short sentences, people here have not been convicted of the crimes that they're accused of, but they're still sitting in jail, sitting in an incarceration, in a correctional institution, and certainly have their freedom stripped of them for the most part, even if they still have some rights, which I certainly try to advocate for people, their religious rights, other rights that they do have. All right, so let's look at the next text. I promise I'll make sure to save time for questions, 15, 20 minutes at the end. This is earlier on in Tractate Brachot, actually very relevant. This is the Haftarah, the prophetic portion for the first day of Rosh Hashanah that we'll be reading, whether we're in synagogue or not. We should still read it this coming Shabbat, the first day of Rosh Hashanah. So it's the story of Hannah and her prayer for to be answered for a son, and the high priest Eli, who suspects her of being drunk instead of praying from her heart with her lips moving and no words coming out. So the Gemara says, the verse continues, Eli answered and said, "May you go in peace." This is after she defended herself and said, "No, I'm not drunk." She still said, he said, "Go in peace." Rabbi Elazar said, from here, it's derived that one who suspects another of something that he has not done must appease him. Moreover, the one who suspected him must bless him. As Eli continued and offered Hannah a blessing, as it said, "May God of Israel grant your request that you have asked of him." So personally, I always have to remind myself, certainly I'm human, and humans are often want to judge people, to make assumptions, to make conclusions. But one of the privileges of being the chaplain is that I'm not here to judge people. I often, whether it's in the computer or otherwise, or people share with me, I'm more often than not aware of what people are are accused of, the crimes that they're accused of, but I try not to judge people for what they're here for, and really, really try to do my best and not, again, I might be aware, I often, might find out, sometimes they even tell me to look up in the newspaper what the articles are, but especially this season of Tshuva, trying to see people as human and seeing them as capable of change, and even if this is a system that doesn't often give as many opportunities as it really should for allowing people to change and improve and change their actions and become different people and change people, I really try to offer that to people to allow them to be seen as human, to allow them to be seen as whole people and not just the person in the tan or green uniform that they're wearing when I see them in jail. So I have a couple sources from Tanakh I want to look at. So as I mentioned, Judaism doesn't prescribe jail or prison as a punishment, but Tanakh certainly talks about, knew of it as an institution, even if it wasn't being implemented by the Torah or by the Jewish society or Jewish state. So Psalm 107 is one of the sources for Birkat HaGomel, for the prayer that we recite, the prayer of gratitude that's traditionally recited when someone is redeemed from a dangerous situation. So according to Jewish law, it's recited in 4 particular cases, which is someone who's recovered from illness, someone who has crossed a desert, and someone who has crossed a sea or an ocean. And the 4th one being someone who was released from captivity. So it's worth looking at this, even if the theological assumption isn't necessarily something I would assume very much don't. But it's worth looking at it because it's a significant source for the difficulty and the danger, the fact that Jewish law very much sees incarceration as a danger and the redemption that comes from someone being released. Again, hopefully to a better life, but so many cases not. Some lived in deepest darkness, bound in cruel irons, because they defied the word of God, spurned the counsel of the Most High. He humbled their hearts through suffering. They stumbled with no one to help. In their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he rescued them from their troubles. He brought them out of deepest darkness, broke their bonds asunder. Let them praise the Lord for his steadfast love, his wondrous deeds for mankind. I feel so bad I forgot to share my screen. I'm going to do that right now. Again, hopefully you got the link that I know Eddie put in again, but I'm going to share it once again so everyone can see it and see where I am. All right, so now we should be sharing. All right, hopefully all right, we're still in business here. Sorry, screen froze for a second. And page got moved a little. All right. Some lived in deepest darkness, bound in cruel irons, because they defied the word of God, spurned the counsel of the Most High. He humbled their hearts through suffering, and they stumbled with no one to help. In their adversity, they cried to the Lord, and he rescued them from their troubles. He brought them out of deepest darkness, broke their bonds asunder. Let them praise the Lord for his steadfast love, his wondrous deeds for mankind. So I certainly struggle with some of the theology in this passage from Tehillim, from our sacred book of Psalms, because I don't believe that everyone or most of the people who are in jail are doing so because they rebelled against God. And again, I don't judge them for that. But certainly the last few verses that a lot of people do cry out to God. I think I prayed with 2 or 3 people just this morning, and people, even if they don't pray with me, they're often praying, they're hoping, they're praying for redemption, they're praying for their families, they're praying for moving forward, they're praying for forgiveness. So very, very much people crying out to God, and people praying for freedom, for release, for being brought out of this darkness. And very much I'm not here to judge people. I don't know, I'm not the one who decides whether people are guilty or not guilty. But I certainly join in their hope, which is something I would do in the hospital. Just like in the hospital, I wasn't the one who decided. I was in God's hand whether people were healed or not, but I joined in their hope for healing and for redemption and deliverance. So kind of jumping around Tanakh a little bit, rehabilitation, restoration after incarceration. So as I touched on a couple times, unfortunately, our system often doesn't provide for enough correction, for enough reentry, for enough hope. Before COVID, we would have reentry programs working within the facilities and some classes and certifications available for people with the hope that people would come out with skills, but it wasn't always as much as I would hope or as much as we would wish. And again, the system is very, very much broken. But this is an interesting source we have in Tanakh that kind of touches, that really spoke to me. This is the very, very end, the last 4 verses of the book of 2 Kings, and the same passage actually appears in the book of Jeremiah. So this is after the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem, and one of the kings, there were actually 2 different kings who were exiled, but the first king of Judea who was exiled was King Jehoiachin, and he was incarcerated in Babylonia by King Nebuchadnezzar. And then this talks about, and 37 years later, so he was incarcerated for 30 years, imprisoned by being the king of being the king of a nation that was conquered. So in the 37th year, on the 27th day of the 12th month, and the year he became king, this next king, Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Abel Merodach, doesn't have anything to do with evil, Babylonian word. He took note of King Jehoiachin of Judah and released him from prison. He spoke kindly to him and gave him a throne above all the other kings. His prison garments were removed and received regular rations by his favor for the rest of his life. So I just see this as a really beautiful image in terms of what release from jail and prison can look like. You know, in this country, unfortunately, basically people are released from prison to get a bus ticket and a few dollars maybe. But the kind of hope that it should be of really allowing people to pick up their life, to live a better life, to be a better part of society than they were before, ideally. So certainly a vision that I have, even if it's not what I see in a lot of cases. And so many cases where I see people coming back to jail for various reasons, very sadly. You know, because they make mistakes, or in a lot of cases because the parole system in this country is really set up for people to fail. I could talk for a long time. I'm gonna try to be short in the next few minutes so we can get to the questions that people have posted. But I will just mention very briefly that the parole system is very broken, and I see so many cases where people come back to jail for very, very minor things because they broke their conditions of parole, according to the parole officers. So I think we'll look at one more source, and then we'll summarize the last source since it's quite long. So this is a source that inspires me as a prison chaplain, as someone who has this privilege to kind of have access in this institution, have access to the people, and be able to be present with them and see them, especially at this time when visitors are not allowed. There are video visits, but for the most part, all visits and all volunteers have stopped in our institution and in so many other jails and prisons. Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me as a herald of joy to the humble, to bind up the wounded heart, to proclaim release to the captives, liberation to the imprisoned, to proclaim a year of the Lord's favor and a day of vindication by our God, to comfort all who mourn, to provide for the mourners in Zion, to give them a turban instead of ashes, the festive ointment instead of mourning, a garment of splendor instead of a drooping spirit. They should be high terebinths of victory planted by the Lord for his glory. This is from the very end of the book of Isaiah, actually right around where the Haftarot of consolation that we read the past 7 weeks are found. And again, very much speaks to me, even if I'm not God's anointed or a prophet, only a rabbi, but see my job, my ability in here to give joy to people who are humbled in this situation, to try to help lift people up spiritually and at least give them some kind of spiritual release from being locked in an incarcerated facility. Again, very much speaks to me. I think it's very inspirational for what we can try to give people. And I saw there was a question about what we can do on the outside, and I'll try to speak to that as well. So the last source I'm just going to summarize briefly. You can see that it's quite long, and I encourage you to read on your own. This is from the book of Yechezkel, book of Ezekiel, and it's one of a couple sources where he talks about this theology of tshuva, and very appropriate for this time. And basically tells people not to rest on their laurels, that people aren't righteous or wicked, it's about what you do. That if someone is righteous, it's because they follow God's laws and do the right thing. But then if that righteous person turns around and starts sinning, starts hurting other people, starts making mistakes, they can't just say that, oh, I was righteous before, I can do whatever I want, God says I'm righteous. But the opposite is true very much also. That, look around verse 18. Be sure his father, he practiced fraud, robbed his brother, act wickedly, he did die for his iniquity. That, and the verses before that, that even if someone's ancestors made a mistake, the person who, that person can always do tshuva. Look at verse 23 very briefly. Is it my desire that a wicked person shall die, says the Lord God, is rather he should turn back from his ways and live. This pasuk we see especially in the Ne'ilah service and the High Holiday liturgy. So again, that speaks to me. Again, I'm not here to judge people, but certainly can try to inspire people to live better kinds of lives that they want to live. And if some kind of tshuva to God or to society is something that they want to do, to provide them with the framework to do that. So just point out, again, you should feel free to go back to these packets to hold on to them virtually. But on the next page I have for farther reading, Jewish sources, and some in Hebrew, some in English about incarceration. And then on the last page, some books that I've read. I'm trying to take upon myself to read about incarceration, especially incarceration and mental health, including in the New York City system. So you can get more of an insight into what I was able to talk about briefly in here. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to go back to the questions that I wasn't able to answer yet. So I see from Chaplain Orevrina Katz-Cohen, Jewish chaplain in Southern Ontario. Great to meet you. We should talk more. My family actually lives in Toronto, so definitely speaks to me. So certainly have some Jews for Jesus, but not so much. Have a lot of Black Israelites of various theologies and backgrounds. Hebrew Israelite, as I've learned, is a very, very vague term for probably at least a dozen different groups. So there have been some cases where there's certain Black Israelite theologies, kind of very radical groups, which is not the majority at all, where they believe that they're the true Jews, that white appearing Jews are not Jewish at all. And I've had a couple of cases where those people have tried to take over my service or try to correct me, and I kind of have to deal with that gently but firmly, because everyone else there is to learn and have a conversation, and kind of have to deal with that. But then there's also Black Israelite communities, especially the mainstream ones, whose theology and practice is very, very close to mainstream Orthodox Conservative Reform Reconstructionist Judaism. And I've had a lot of pleasure working with those people, even if they identify as Israelite and not Jewish. Again, I teach Judaism, I try to make it pluralistic, but, teaching what I would consider mainstream Judaism, but try to be as inclusive of people as long as they're respectful of my beliefs as well. In terms of advocating for incarcerated Jews, certainly a lot of work that people are doing. I know a lot of work that Rabbi has done in terms of advocacy against solitary confinement. I can speak so much more about thoughts and experience about that. I wish I had a lot more time. There's one organization I work closely with called the Aleph Institute. It's an organization from Chabad. They do a lot of wonderful things, but the one caveat is they only work with people who are halakhically Jewish. So they only serve a small subset of the people I serve. So I do work with them. They do a lot of helpful things, but you know, that's certainly one organization, but they don't serve everyone who I serve. In better times, outside of COVID, there are a lot of opportunities to volunteer in jails and prisons, and a lot of jails and prisons don't have paid chaplains, especially paid Jewish chaplains outside of New York and New York State, and often will have volunteers leading the services. But right now during COVID, I know we're not allowing any volunteers in, and I'm sure most facilities aren't as well, unfortunately. And high holidays, unfortunately, we're trying to negotiate reopening services at some point soon, but right now we're not having any gatherings. I'm trying to negotiate as we speak to try to have shofar being able to be blown for people, but it's very, very hard speaking about advocacy. So I certainly advocate for people's religious needs. I advocate for spiritual needs and mental health needs as much as I can within the system, but it's quite a bureaucracy, and I often run up against brick walls, and this is one of them. Again, trying the best I can right now with the system that we have. In terms of the Chagim celebrations from Chaplain or Verena again, it might be different because we're a jail and not a prison. You know, we have this, I mean, we have a great ministerial services department, and one of my supervisors is amazing in making sure everyone's religious needs are met. And I guess that might be one of the reasons, but the celebrations are really quite beautiful when they happen. In the past, high holiday services have been led by rabbinical students. I never did it myself, but really, really dedicated people who sleep over, who would sleep in a classroom in the jail for all Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach Seders as well. But unfortunately, this year, everything is suspended. Just going down. I don't know the answer to how rabbis respond to the creation of jails. One of the books I just read that's in the suggested reading list, let me just find the title of the one I'm referring to. Waiting for an Echo by Dr. Christine Montross talks about the creation of jails and prisons in the United States, the Philadelphia system, and especially the Eastern States Penitentiary. So I know that they had a synagogue in that first penitentiary in Philadelphia, but I'm not sure how Jews responded at that point. So in terms of Jews of color, so 75% to 80% of people in the Department of Correction at any given time are people of color, Black or Hispanic or other ethnicities or identifications. So I have Jews of color, and I have people, you know, I'd say most of the people I serve are people of color. As I mentioned at the beginning, a lot of them didn't have a Jewish background beforehand. They're spiritual seekers. They're coming to Judaism for the first time, but the vast majority are people of color. So I see a few more questions here. I'm just going to keep scrolling and, you know, have a few more minutes. Staff seek me out. So I've learned that we don't use the term guard. It's kind of part of navigating working here, but they use the term correction officers. And they often do. It's often hard for them to connect with me. You know, they're in a uniform, I'm not, but I do my best. And because there's so many of them, we have more staff than we have individuals in our custody. But I do see the same staff on a daily basis. I always try to greet them. I always try to ask how they're doing, and often they will open up to me. And I want them to see me as there for them as much as I am for those in custody. Yeah, I like, again, Chaplain or Verina's suggestion as well. That, you know, and I often I just, you know, I saw even this morning, again, a lot of these people come from Christian backgrounds or different backgrounds, and, you know, have a trouble wrapping around what Judaism is, that we don't believe in Jesus, that it's a different religion, a different faith. But I try to welcome everyone from where they are. I try to not judge. I try to be firm with what our boundaries are, but trying to, you know, welcome everyone as much as possible. Interesting answer to question about shofar via Zoom. So people in our custody don't have any internet access. They, about a year and a half ago, we were actually one of the first jurisdictions to allow free nationwide phone calls from jail. People get a certain number of phone calls per day, but it's all free. Also during COVID, they get a certain number of letters per week because there's no visits. And they just started giving out tablets with no internet access, but with a lot of programming on it for people to use during certain daytime hours. So they're rolling it out. And thank God we were able to put a lot of religious content on it. I was able to put some Sidurim, Amoxorim, Tanakh, and some videos of services. So I think the videos probably have the shofar on it, but especially for the Orthodox Jews, and we do have a certain number of Orthodox Jews, you know, they wouldn't be comfortable. It would have to be done that day in person, according to Jewish law, according to Halacha. So trying to negotiate that. I'm trying to get it done outside ideally, but it might not happen. Though most of the Rikers Island is a separate island, most of the jails don't have a way to just blow it right outside. But we're trying to negotiate that. Any other questions in the last few minutes? These are great questions, and I appreciate the ability to dialogue, even if it's not as face-to-face. God willing, when the epidemic's over, can have more opportunities to speak about these issues in person, God willing.
Awesome. Well, thank you everybody who joined on the Zoom directly, and all those folks watching from social media. We appreciate you. But most of all, we appreciate you, Rabbi Gabriel. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. We can truly feel your passion, and I think that's what resonates. And I think when folks are in sometimes the toughest times in their life, a little bit of spirituality, a little bit of hope, that light in the darkest night is what truly resonates with folks. So definitely appreciate you, Rabbi Gabriel. Folks, for those of you who missed out on today's session, for those of you who want to maybe share this, we will be recording it and blasting it out on our email. So make sure you're looking for your inbox for our next webinars. Make sure you sign up for our next event coming up. Don't forget about our Jewish response to poverty and hunger. That is going to be this upcoming 16th from 4 p.m. Eastern timing. That's going to be with our friends from Mazone and our friends from American Jewish World Services and our very own Rabbi Shmuley. So again, to finish off, thank you so much, Rabbi Gabriel, for sharing with us today. I think it was a very good way to start off our day, a very good thing to hold in our hearts. We appreciate you and your work, and we look forward to collaborating once more. Everybody have an amazing day, and look forward to seeing y'all on the next series. Take care.